Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're at in the world. Welcome to the third and final day of the 2020 International E-Conference on Atheism. I'm Dr. Darren Slade. I'm the president of the Global Center for Religious Research, and I'll also be your host for today's presentation. I want to say thank you so much for coming out and supporting us. What's incredible about this three-day academic conference is that you didn't have to buy any airline tickets, you didn't have to get a hotel room. You get to hear the latest philosophical and scientific research on atheism from scholars all over the world, all from the comfort and safety of your own home. So thanks again for being here. Now, I have the distinct privilege of being able to introduce a man who does not need an introduction. You all know him real well, Mr. Aaron Raw, and his talk today is on the evolution of religion. Now, of course, Aaron is known the world over for being a vocal atheist activist. He is creator of the spectacular atheist blog Reason Advocates on Patheos. He's the official representative of the American Atheists and creator and host of the wildly popular Aaron Raw YouTube channel and the Raw Men podcast. He's past president of the Atheist Alliance of America and a prolific debater and critic of creationism. And it's in fact this very last point that I want to emphasize. If you get a chance, you have got to purchase a copy of Foundational Falsehoods of Creationism. Now, this book by Aaron is easily the most definitive takedown of creation scientists and intelligent design. Now, as many of you already know, creationists in their attack on evolution oftentimes use nice sounding arguments, scientific sounding arguments oftentimes. But what Aaron does in this book is he demonstrates just how every single one of those arguments are founded on fundamental scientific, religious, and historical falsehoods. So again, if you get a chance to get this book, I highly recommend it. It is absolutely phenomenal. It's kind of my go-to resource whenever I'm debating or thinking about creationism. Now, I get to turn it over to my good friend Aaron here. You have the floor, sir.
All right. I'm sorry to say that my name is pronounced Aaron. Sorry.
Of course it is. You should tell, because it wasn't originally that, right? When did you change your name?
No, I changed my last name. Was my birth name was not Ra, but
interesting.
Yeah. So
thank you for saying that. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so I was baptized into the Mormon church when I was 8 years old, but I never identified as Mormon. For a while, we lived in parts of New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah where practically everyone was Mormon, or we lived in Los Angeles where being Mormon was weird. And people would ask me, what religion are you? And I would say that, well, my family is Mormon, and then never got far enough to say that I don't know whether I am. Because as soon as anyone thought that I was Mormon, they'd start telling me crazy things that Mormons allegedly believe, as if Mormons wouldn't know what they believe unless they hear it from a Southern Baptist. Sometimes I'd invite them in to tell my mother that she believes all these specific things, but they always refused. And I figured it was because they already knew that my mother didn't really believe all the things that they said that she did. And they didn't want to find out how things really are. They just want to believe what they want to believe, regardless what the truth is. And this is a common trait among religious believers and conspiracy theorists and many forms of prejudice. They just want to believe what they want to believe, even when they know that it's probably wrong. I mean, Mormons do believe some crazy shit. Every religion does. But if you want to know what a Mormon believes or what a Buddhist or a Hindu believes, don't ask a Baptist, because many outsiders would rather give you the wrong answer than to admit that they don't know, especially when that question gives them opportunity to break the ninth commandment by expressing their bigotry. They're not even sure what their own beliefs are, because when I ask Baptists what they believe, I keep getting different answers. I never identified as Mormon because I didn't know whether I believed everything required to be a Mormon. And how would I know whether some other religion might suit me better, since I didn't know anything at all about any of the other religions? Experiencing the kind of interdenominational discrimination that I did set me on a path. I figured that the truth at the heart of the matter would be the root, the foundation, because whatever distinction makes any denomination unique among all the others is not going to turn out to be some profound truth that every other religion around the world had somehow overlooked for thousands of years, until this one new cult finally popped up, say in Waco, Texas, 1991, as if they're the only ones who know better than anyone else, and that's why the forces of evil are attacking their compound. No, God would have to be a better communicator than that. Whatever the real truth is, will not be some unique peculiarity where Mormons and Branch Davidians differ from everyone else. The differences are what the group got wrong. The truth will be something held in common by every sect all the way back to the very beginning. So I started comparing religions to trace the origins of the faith. Now, the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith grew up in Western New York, and he was apparently influenced by the intense religious revivalism that Protestants were conducting at that time. So I figured that Smith used Protestant Christianity as his template, and that he created a whole other religion out of that with all new mythology that he wrote himself. Other religions, like Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses and others, seem to branch off of Protestant Christianity too, yet some deny their pedigree, while proclaiming divine revelation to get back to the real, originally intended message, which was somehow never written down anywhere until just now, and only this one little cult knows about it, fuck everyone else. Likewise, Mormons too insist that they're not Protestants, and Protestants insist that Mormons are not even Christian. And I don't see where Protestants get the right to say that they're not. Protestants like to say that Jehovah's Witnesses and aren't really Christians either, and neither are Catholics. When you lump all the self-identified Christians in the world together, including Mormons, JWs, and the whole Christian collective, over half of them are Catholic. So if Catholics are not Christian, then Christianity is no longer the world's leading religion. Islam would be the dominant faith worldwide. This is my rescue kitty. And after Islam would be Hinduism in second place, then Catholicism, and finally Christianity in fourth place. Is that how the Protestants want it? Catholicism claims to be the oldest Christian denomination, although Orthodoxy makes the same claim with more justification, because Christianity took a few centuries to take shape. I would think that God's word would be markedly distinct and definitely superior to anything lowly humans could write. But all the scriptures presented as God-breathed are indistinguishable from the ravings of mere fallible men. So there appears to have been a series of committee decisions required to weed out which gospels and other writings should be included as divinely inspired and which should be denounced and destroyed as damnable sacrilege. Then, as soon as there was a unified Christianity, there was an immediate schism between Orthodox and Catholics who fought bloody wars with each other for centuries after, forgetting all about how to love thy neighbor. Then, of course, Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation, literally protesting Catholicism with what was then defined as heresy. And those two fought centuries of bloody wars against each other, too, neither one able to turn the other cheek despite what their shared patron deity allegedly advised. At the same time as Joseph Smith, there was another self-proclaimed prophet in Israel who started not just another denomination of Christianity, but a whole other religion apart from that. On the Baha'i webpage, it says that throughout history, God had sent down different prophets, including Abraham, Krishna, Zoroaster, Moses, Buddha, Jesus, and Muhammad, and that Baha'u'llah is the latest of these messengers. The thing is that the Quran says almost exactly the same thing, except that it says that Muhammad is the final prophet and that there would be no more after him. So you try to be inclusive and it still creates conflict. At some point between Muhammad and Baha'u'llah came another prophet, Guru Nanak, in the 15th century in what was then Punjab, India, and is now Pakistan. The message that God delivered to Guru Nanak was that neither of the two great religions is the true path. So Guru Nanak founded Sikhism, currently the world's 5th largest religion, as a middle path between the two great religions, which God identified as Islam and Hinduism. Because somehow Christianity wasn't important enough in medieval Punjab to even get a message, to even get a mention. And God didn't think so. And we know that because his prophet told us. And that's the only way anyone knows anything God ever said. We have to accept whatever the prophets tell us, even when those prophets disagree with each other, such that we know someone's got to be lying. Think about that. It means we don't really know whether God ever even said anything. And if he did, then we know what God should already know, that he shouldn't be using prophets, because they're just going to mess the message up in a game of Chinese telephone, as has reportedly always been the case with every religion ever founded so far. Because every prophet foolishly goes off script and starts his own new and different religion, and every religion gets corrupted by those who believe in it, which ought to tell you that no religion is really true, and that we ought to throw out all our scriptures because they're just man-made mythology written by mere fallible people who obviously never knew what they were talking about. I've heard it said that the reason there are so many different religions is that we're all like blind men trying to describe an elephant according to the one part they can touch. And one part has a trunk or the tusk or a leg or ear or the tail. And all their descriptions are correct, although incomplete. However, that analogy doesn't work with religion because they're all claiming mutually exclusive things. If you're Christian, you're going to the Muslim hell. If you're Muslim, you're going to the Christian hell. And other options include that you could be reincarnated forever and ever, over and over again, never having achieved either nirvana nor Krishna consciousness. I said in my book that the Jewish Torah, the Christian Gospels, the Quran of Islam, the Kitab-i-Aqdas of Baha'u'llah, the Avestas of Zarathustra, the Adi Granth of the Sikhs, the Hindu Vedas, and the Mahabharata's Bhagavad Gita, the Book of Mormon, and the Urantia book are all declared by some devotees to be the absolute truth and the revealed word of the one true God, and believers of each say the others are deceived. And the only logical probability is that they're all deceived. But of course, religion doesn't listen to reason. Christians often pretend to be unique among religions because the whole world marks a calendar based on the birth of Jesus. And what they don't understand is that there were already a number of conflicting calendars in use all at once. Then in the year 1627, on the Julian calendar, Pope Gregory VIII, arguably the most powerful man in the world at that time, created his own calendar and backdated it to what he thought was Jesus' birthday. He knew that Jesus was supposed to have been born both before the year 41 on the Julian calendar and simultaneously after the 50th year on that same calendar. Unable to admit the impossible contradiction there and with no way to reconcile it, Pope Gregory simply chose a date in the middle and started his Gregorian calendar from there. Then, when the Western world became the financial center that it is, everyone else adopted our calendar too. And that's why this is the year 2020 and not 2065 or 5780 like the Jewish calendar. So when you hear me talk about dates in BC, I mean before calendar, not before Christ. I have met Christians who think that Christianity is the world's oldest religion, forgetting that Jesus himself was described as Jewish and that there can be no Christianity before Christ. And similarly, the Quran says that Islam was the true religion of Abraham, Moses, and even Jesus, meaning that Jesus was actually Muslim rather than Jewish, because Muslims believe that the Jewish and Christian religions, as well as the Bible itself, are all corruptions of the true Word of God. The truth is that Islam is based largely on an early version of Christianity, one that held that Jesus was a mediator between men and God, that he was a prophet with magic powers like many prophets were said to have, regardless of what religion they professed, but that Jesus was not a physical manifestation of the Creator, not God in the flesh, and not the Son of God either. Muslims believe that Jesus was never crucified, that he never died, and that he kept healing people discreetly for centuries after the Gospels, and that he effectively retired after Muhammad became the next and final prophet of the God and religion of Abraham. Christianity, in turn, is based on Judaism, with some Greek and Persian influences, which I'll explain in a moment. So Christianity is mostly Jewish, but Judaism isn't the oldest religion either. It's not even the oldest monotheistic religion, and it didn't start out monotheist. I took a course in the history of comparative world religions, which taught how Judaism was originally polytheist, having evolved out of a collection of closely associated Semitic religions, blended with a compilation of Mesopotamian mythology, and eventually influenced by the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism. with one important distinction. The Jews believed, much like the Greeks and Mesopotamians before them, that everyone goes to the same place when we die, an underworld of the dead where everyone's soul, good or bad, would go to rest, meaning sleep. But Christians changed the Hebrew Sheol into hell, and they came up with the notion of heaven as a posthumous judgment based on a Zoroastrian idea that Judaism never adopted, that the soul of the righteous man will ascend to the kingdom of justice and truth under the wise Lord Ahura Mazda, but the soul of the wicked man will descend into the kingdom of the lie ruled by Ahriman the opposer, also known as Ha-Shetan, the Satan, which means the opposer or enemy. This is where Christians got the idea that they would go to heaven or hell depending on whether they were good or bad. But an important fact that is always overlooked is that morality is not even part of that equation, because believers can always be forgiven no matter how evil they are, and unbelievers can never be tolerated no matter how good they are. So morality is irrelevant. All that matters is, did you buy into the scam? Are you an obedient minion? Will you do as you're told and pay your tithe? Believe what we say simply because we said so, and don't even ask for evidence. Just take it on faith. Thus, gullibility is the sole criteria for redemption. So if you love sin, whatever that means, be a Christian. If you have a personal relationship with Jesus, then you can sin all you want to. And your magic imaginary friend will always forgive you for it because he's only in your mind. So he already understands and agrees with all your bullshit excuses. You love truth instead, meaning things we can actually know and show to be true, then no religion will satisfy you. So Islam is based on Christianity, which is based on Judaism, and these three religions of peace have typically been at war with each other since their inceptions. Each of them have been influenced by Zoroastrianism, which isn't the oldest religion in continuous practice either. Hinduism is. And that doesn't mean that Hinduism is the oldest religion there ever was. There are plenty of others that we know of that are older, but they're not practiced much anymore. And while there is a taxonomic tree of sorts to show how the different religions are related, there's no clear connection between the Abrahamic and Indian religions, meaning that one did not come from the other. Well, there is a story in Genesis where Jacob wrestles God and wins, even though God cheated by hitting Jacob below the belt. And there's a similar story in the Mahabharata where King Arjuna wrestled with one of the lesser Hindu gods and won, even though that god also hit Arjuna in the nards. That and Lord Krishna gave sight to the blind, and Indra walked on water. And there's a lot of common tropes of the various religions. Compare the Greek myth of Pandora's box to the temptation of Eve. Then remember that Prometheus was crucified to atone for the sins of man, and Dionysus died and rose again, declaring himself the fruit of the vine, just like Jesus eventually did too. Yet all these myths are many centuries older than any of the stories about Jesus, which tells me that either Dionysus could turn water into wine just like Jesus did, or, and this is infinitely more likely, Jesus didn't really do it either. A lot of folks believe that the book of Genesis is the oldest book ever written. And those people are unaware that there are a few different religions with creation myths that are thousands of years older than even the oldest book of the Bible, which is not Genesis. There are lots of websites saying that the oldest book of the Bible, meaning the first one to be written, is the book of Job, which was often supposed to be from 1500 years before our current calendar. But some scholars have corrected me on this, saying that Job is nowhere near that old, that the oldest books of the Bible are actually Amos and Hosea, dating to the 8th century BC. Interestingly, and I don't know whether anyone else has noticed this coincidence, but although the Rig Veda, the earliest of the Hindu scriptures, is dated to at least 1500 BC, the Bhagavad Gita, which I'm told is the beginning of Chaitanya Vaishnavism or Hare Krishna, was contextually dated to the 6th or 7th century BC because it seems to reference what was being said by Ionian Greeks at that time. The first time an atheist position on secular science was espoused by any collective, and Lord Krishna was complaining about that in the Gita. And then Zarathustra, the prophet of Zoroastrianism, who also hails from the 6th or 7th century BC, And many of the Greek myths on Hellenism were published at about that same time, and much of the Bible was composed in the 6th and 7th century BC. And the first Buddha hails from the early part of the 5th century BC. So not every religion, but most of the ones we know of all appeared at about the same time, a half dozen centuries before Christianity. It was like a Cambrian explosion of several different religious perspectives occurring all at once. And that is when we see the emergence of gods that were more than just people with magic powers, which is what all the gods had been before. Even the Abrahamic God is originally depicted as a magical man who walks, talks, eats, waves his hand, turns his head, shows his backside, and cheats at wrestling. Some of the gods probably started out as powerful people who were grossly exaggerated over many generations, while their real identities were lost in antiquity. And some religions now have the one big all-powerful spirit-type god. Hinduism has that in the form of a triune godhead, but with a bunch of lesser gods mixed in. And some primitive religions have gods that are really just nature anthropomorphized, like the god of rivers, the god of seasons, the god of the hunt, or the god of beer making. And many religions also have a god of death. In the earliest religions, these weren't necessarily gods, but merely spirits. Not every religion had gods, but every religion universally accepted as such by both adherents and critics is a doctrine of ritual traditions, ceremonies, mythology, and the associated dogma of a faith-based belief system that includes the idea that a supernatural essence of self, be it the soul or consciousness or memories, etc., may in some way transcend the death of the physical body and continue on in some other form. Not every religion has gods, but every religion posits the notion of a spirit. In mythology, anything could have a spirit, but every living thing that breathed certainly did. So I want to share some hypotheses I have about how religions began, starting with why we believe in spirits. Why do so many people think that we have an immortal, supernatural soul? We feel the breeze move against our bodies all the time. Early tribes of primitive people couldn't explain the changes in the clouds or the weather they brought, but they knew that the wind could move things, even carry things off into the sky, as if held in invisible hands. They didn't know what smoke was, but they thought that dust devils were literally devils. That's where the legends of genies come from. Whirlwinds would appear out of nowhere and throw all your stuff around and then disappear into evanescence. That's how we still imagine spirits today, at least the devilish ones. No one understood diseases either, but they figured out pretty quickly that rancid fumes or the death of a sick person could make others sick too. That's why they say bless you when you sneeze, because sneezing and coughing are how you spread disease. And they thought that when you sneeze, the good spirit leaves your body and an evil spirit might jump in and take its place. If you're sneezing or coughing, then you're spreading evil spirits that might kill you or someone else. Note that in the Bible, God performs a golem spell where he fashions a man out of mud and breathes into it the breath of life to animate it and make it come alive, wherein Adam did not acquire a soul. Instead, he became a living soul. And there are a few other versions of this trope in earlier creation, as from Mesopotamia through the Orient, wherein some form of magician makes a variable number of people come alive by magically animating clay figurines. I imagine that this belief must have prompted someone to try mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and it certainly would have cemented their belief if it worked. There are also other references to this breath of life where the movement of air is akin to a spiritual essence. A traditional Jewish belief is that when newborns take their first breath, they are infused with the spirit and become a living soul. So air equals spirit. The English word spirit comes from the Latin word meaning to breathe. Since no one yet understood that air was made of particulate matter, but everyone knew you would die if you couldn't breathe, and they knew that when people or animals die, they stop breathing, then it was believed that the movement of air was somehow spiritual, and that this spirit went inside you to give you life. In Genesis 1:2, when it says that only the Spirit of God moved over the face of the waters, it's pretty obviously talking about the wind. For another example, Ezekiel 37:5-8 has a necromancer going into a boneyard to revive an army of the dead, wherein, I quote, Thus saith the Lord God unto these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, yet ye shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and bring up flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and breathe in you, or put breath in you. And you will know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and I prophesied, and as I prophesied, there was a noise, and behold, a shaking, and the bones came together, bone to his bone. And then I beheld, lo, the sinews and the flesh came upon them, and the skin covered them above, but there was no breath in them. Then said he unto me, Prophesy unto the wind, prophesy, son of man, and say to the wind, Thus saith the Lord God, Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived, and stood up upon their feet, an exceeding great army. I should note that the four winds, or anomoi, animate, were Greek gods, different from Jehovah, the Hebrew volcano god. And it's interesting that Jehovah tells one of his own prophets to pray to the four winds. And of course, the flood in Genesis 6 was meant to drown everything that had the breath of life. Ecclesiastes 3:18-21 gives another example of how our notions of spirituality actually stem from a misunderstanding of the natural aspects of air. I said to myself concerning the sons of men, God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there is no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place. All came from the dust, and all return to the dust. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward, and the breath of the beast descends downward to the earth? Notice here again that if we had a soul, then animals have one too, but we don't. It's just our breath, and all the rest is vanity. And this is according to the New American Standard Bible, the New Revised Standard Version, the American Standard Version, and the King James Version all replace the word breath with spirit. And likewise, if you compare Luke 23:46 in the New American Standard, or the New Revised Standard Versions of the Bible with the King James or the American Standard Version, you'll see again that when the story says that Jesus commits his spirit to God and breathed his last, it means the same thing as when he gave up the ghost. In each case, they make clear that the breath of life is his spirit. And this translation eloquently illustrates the gaseous origin of man's belief in his own soul. We don't have a supernatural spirit. All of that is literally nothing more than hot air. And we tend to imagine agency behind everything. If we see that something bad is about to happen, like the storm isn't even here yet, but the normally dry gulch that we're in is already flash flooding, or you see that falling rocks are about to crush your hut, or you notice that the local leopard is carrying off another one of your kids, you start talking to whatever the event is, telling it not to happen, or telling reality to be some other way. No, don't turn left. We still do that, even though it doesn't work. The primitive myths have God people making things with no description of how they are made, just telling things to be as they are, and they are. And knowing that, remember that one of the earliest forms of rendering is playing in the mud, making things out of clay. So I imagine some Paleolithic artist making a pretty good rendering of a giraffe. Those have a fairly distinctive shape. Then he moves on to sculpt a Venus, an exaggerated female figure that is practically all boobs and butt. He shows his latest figurine to the rest of his tribe, wishing he could breathe into it and bring it to life. Wouldn't it be neat if we had the power to do that? Then his buddy throws another hemp bush on the fire, and they sit around the fire and speculate that if anyone ever could do that, then maybe somebody already did do that. And that's where all these animals came from. Hey, maybe that's where we came from. Then almost immediately the word maybe is replaced with certainly. If your people like that story and repeat it to their kids around the fire, along with whatever other stories they made up about who they think the stars and planets are, or where they think everything but the gods came from, they'll agree to embrace those stories and believe in them, especially if these beliefs are in some way enhanced. I suggested that the origin of religion might have been influenced by burning piles of hemp in the community fire, but it could just as easily be from consuming opium, peyote, ayahuasca, psychedelic mushrooms, or some other mind-altering drug. All of these are associated with spiritual rituals. At the very least, there would be some form of alcohol involved, because beer is the first thing people ever invented, and many religions, including the most primitive ones, practice ritually imbibing. Some still do. Now imagine the effects that hallucinogenic drugs would have to expand the mind of people who don't know anything at all about science, but who already think that the movement of smoke in the wind and the shadows that the campfire makes of all that are all ghostly spirits trying to communicate with us through secret coded messages in our dreams and drug-addled hallucinations, to say nothing of however you might interpret any random event as if it were an omen, because believers think every apparent accident happens because it was intended to, well in advance. And yet, believers somehow still think they have free will. And that's before we even mention pre-existing mental conditions, because there's a definite correlation between extreme religious susceptibility and paranoid pattern perception. In both cases, the subject believes they have special access to privileged information and hidden knowledge, and they will not be reasoned out of it. The mantra of our spiritual journey is, don't stop believing, hold on to that feeling. Religious belief has been likened to drug addiction. Some people get a definite high out of pretending that they have a special purpose, as if they are the reason the universe was created. And they're best friends with the most powerful being imaginable, who can even make 2 + 2 = 5 if need be. I've personally encountered several believers who have admitted in one way or another that they will continue to believe even if they know it's not really true, because their fantasy matters more to them than reality ever could. At the same time, all this exclusive information isn't empowering unless it's also justified by other people playing along, believing the same thing. And this behavior wouldn't be limited just to the weirdos of the village either, because nobody knows any better. So when the weirdos eventually achieve leadership position, as narcissists often do, then they can impose their beliefs on everyone else and enforce them, demanding that the unbelieving infidels be executed on the word of 1 or 2 witnesses. In a situation like that, it would be very few generations before natural selection weeds out all the skeptics, leaving only credulous believers. A few years ago, the National Alliance on Mental Illness described a delusion as a persistent false belief that is maintained despite indisputable evidence to the contrary, to falsely claim something even when there is evidence otherwise. And they went on to say that what makes these beliefs delusional is that they don't change when the person is presented with conflicting information. The beliefs remain fixed even when the facts contradict them. And by this definition, religion is definitely delusional. And for that reason, they have since changed the definition such that it's not considered a delusion if the belief is commonly shared in the parent culture. But that still means that the old adage is correct, that when one person suffers from a delusion, it's called insanity, but when many people suffer from a delusion, it's called religion. And religion is the most powerful tool ever devised for manipulation of the masses. If you can convince people that some inescapable, indomitable despot is watching everything they do every minute of every day, and that it even knows what they're thinking, and that it's going to report them or punish them unless they bow in obeisance to the church, then you can control, oppress, and exploit them all. And claiming a relationship with the gods also tends to award social, financial, and political power, as the most religious people are treated as good and wise and pure, no matter how stupid, evil, and corrupt they really are. And for that reason, more than any other, this group credulity is strictly enforced. If you don't believe the fairy tales of your ancestral culture, that's apostasy, which is treated as a capital offense worthy of the death penalty in practically every religion around the world since time immemorial. But what may have started out as a harmless game of pretend has become a life or death situation where you have to make believe, because if you don't, you risk not only your imaginary soul, but your real life and limb as well. You have to believe exactly what you're told, or else you're challenging the unquestionable yet obviously erroneous assumption of authority. Because if you have a different interpretation of your tribe's folklore, that's heresy, which is just as bad, even though that's how every modern religion started out. If someone changes the sacred stories, that'd be like changing your favorite songs from your youth. What if those original versions aren't there anymore because all that's there is a remastered distortions or remakes by someone else, or parodies by Weird Al? And maybe the new versions are just as good or even better by some metric, but you still hate them because they're not what you were conditioned to love. Religion is no different from classic songs. In fact, some of our religions are songs with some doctrinal verses written to rhyme. You can't change it, not even to improve it, or else you'll mess it up and get burned at the stake. I saw a classic rock band on a reunion tour doing all their old songs, but not the old way. They'd done them so much they were doing them different now. The same thing happened with religion, as the old stories recited by word of mouth slowly changed in subtle but important ways over thousands of years of retelling, with some obvious embellishment adopting and adapting elements of neighboring lore, though we're not supposed to know about any of that. I've often heard that if I don't believe in God, then I should pray, begging for revelation, even if that means praying for a whole week, fasting in the desert, whatever it takes until I get an answer, and that I should never get up until I get it. Because if I pray with my whole heart, I will eventually convince myself that someone is listening, and then I'll keep talking to myself for the rest of my life. That's why the clergy demand that we pray every day or even 5 times a day. The problem is that works with every god, even the false ones, and not just them. It also works with spirit guides and the ghosts of your dead ancestors, even past life remembrance, as well as extraterrestrial telepaths and your totem spirit animal. If you talk to any imaginary being long enough, they will eventually start talking back. And I'm done.
So we actually have a number of questions for you, but I want to explore. Clearly, you specialize in a lot of the Western theistic religions today, and that's kind of where a lot of your presentation focused on. Have you, in your studies, your anthropological studies, have you approached non-theistic religions that are even much more ancient than what we consider theistic religions today, stuff that predate Zoroastrianism and ancient Babylonian religions? Do you ever study those types of things?
To a degree. I mean, there's not a lot that we can actually know about Druidism, for example. I've known a few Druids, but I mean, I've even had to ask them, how do you know that that's what the original Druids worshipped? Because really nobody knows. And animism is pretty popular around the world. That's one of those that could be considered an atheist religion because it doesn't have any gods included. These are one of those that tend to employ spirits and everything. So it's not just that animals have spirits, rocks have spirits too. And that's why you can coax reality into being something else by talking to it. Yes. So I was referencing that, but I haven't done a lot of study on those, and I wish that I could have explored Eastern religions like not so much Buddhism, but Hinduism. Hinduism is enormous, being the oldest religion in continuous practice. I mean, they don't just have a holy book. They have a library, and their books are huge. The Mahabharata that I mentioned a couple of times is the largest epic poem ever, and it's a whole lot bigger than the Bible. The Bhagavad Gita is a whole book like the Bible, but it's only a chapter, a single chapter of the Mahabharata. It's so big. Yeah. So on Krishna, for example, I mean, he's just one of many gods that they have, but there are so many adventures that he has of many types. I mean, he has so much lore dedicated to all of this person's exploits that it would seem that Krishna has to be, much like Jesus, Krishna has to be a compilation of a whole bunch of different characters. There's no way one guy did all these things. not in a regular lifetime.
Interesting. Well, it used to be popular among anthropologists, and my understanding about the first half of the 20th century especially, to attribute animism as kind of the origins of a lot of our theistic religions today. That theory has kind of fallen out of favor, especially in certain circles. Where do you fall in this debate? Do you think that animism was an original form of human thought in our psychological evolution that eventually personified human figures and then became the deities? Or do you think something else may have happened, or that theistic religions grew up contemporaneously with animism?
No, I hold to the prior position. I don't see religions as evolving independently entirely. I mean, I think it started with animism because that goes back tens of thousands of years, and then we don't have the emergence of God figures until relatively very recently. So that seems to be an addition. And the God characters, as I mentioned, I think most of them, some of them at least, began as real people who were just grossly exaggerated, and other gods were made up out of whole cloth, like the goddess of wisdom, for example. I mean, that's not a person that ever existed. That's just a character who was made up to anthropomorphize something. The god of death, the god of beer making, basket weaving, because there was one religion that had a god of basket weaving. So.
That's their superpower, was crocheting stuff. It's great. Would it be fair to say when you were growing up in Mormonism that you weren't completely sold to the idea, that you were more nominal than a devout believer?
Yeah, the family that I grew up in, although some of them became devout Mormons, I mean, nobody was fully into it in my family. I mean, like people were still drinking alcohol and coffee and that sort of thing. I mean, my mother never smoked cigarettes, but she drank, and she certainly had coffee and stuff. And it wasn't until later that she adopted the magic underwear and all of that. So I mean, so I was spared a lot of it, and my family didn't talk about religion or philosophy, or the only time they ever mentioned science was to disparage it. Them scientists, they got book smarts, but they don't got no common sense. That's what I got growing up. Was a whole lot of disrespect for the scientists and believing every kind of conspiracy theory, all of that without question. But you don't take any expert's word for anything. You believe it. You believe every weirdo you meet at the bus stop, but not anybody who actually knows what they're talking about.
Right. Well, so one of the reasons I asked this question is because your story, your background is a bit peculiar when it comes to the atheist community, in that those of us who have become activists were often, before the activist life, the atheist life, were strong believers. We were very devout. I myself was a Baptist minister, and the people I know who are activists, the reason they got into activism is because they were so passionate about a false belief that they now want to rescue people from this delusion. So why did you turn to activism?
Well, I did notice what you were talking about, that people who were once very religious are now the most outspoken anti-religionists, the anti-theists. And it's like when people quit smoking. It's the former smokers are the ones who are most against smoking now. Like myself, when I quit smoking, I put a cigarette back in my mouth after a month or so after the last one I'd ever had, and it was like sucking on a car's exhaust pipe. I couldn't believe that I was ever doing that to myself, and I want to encourage other people. Almost all the men in my family, probably all the men in my family, have died from smoking-related illnesses, perfectly healthy in every other way except what cigarettes did to them. So I understand that parallel pretty well. Whereas Matt Dillahunty was practicing to be a minister, and Seth Andrews was was on Christian radio, and they were both heavily invested in their belief system. I was not heavily invested in that one. What I was exploring was like a neo-pagan occultism, transcendental meditation. I was exploring not just meditation, but rituals and trying to do the astral projection or out-of-body experiences and all of that. I was experimenting with a number of psionic disciplines, and this was all a sort of an attempt to be scientific with the paranormal, because what better experience can you have than firsthand, right? But then I realized how deceptive faith is, that people see auras because they train themselves to see just beyond what their eyes are physically capable of. And that means they're making shit up. You're just pretending to see things that aren't there. And it was a very hard realization for me to discover that things that I think I perceive are being misperceived, that it's actually something else. Yeah. And it was very upsetting I had moments of shared experiences, a couple of them, with transcendental meditation and with paranormal encounters, meeting otherworldly beings. And I'm like, this is not just me, this is other people, and there's no drugs involved. And then, you lose contact with people over many years, and then through the magic of the internet, you rediscover these old relationships, and we start talking with a couple of these people. And I realized that not only do they not remember that the way I do, they don't remember it at all. And these are people I had the experience with. It was shared. And so what can I say with that? So when Christians come and tell me their stories, their stories are usually nowhere near as impressive as what I've already experienced. And if I can challenge my own experience, I can damn sure dismiss yours. And when I shared my experiences, when I still believed them, I remember explaining that to Christians, what I experienced. And they would just dismiss it out of hand. This is a testimony from my own personal experience. You're supposed to value that. I'm supposed to value it when it comes from you. So why is it when it comes from me that it's suddenly worthless? Is it just because it disagrees with you? Well, of course it is.
It reminds me of some of the old psychological experiments that were done with psilocybin and seminary students, and the experiences that they had on the drug were so powerful that oftentimes many of these seminary students who had once been fairly conservative now became things closer akin to universalists and whatnot. The point being is just you can manufacture so many of these experiences that people rely on as testimony and proof of their religion. But I'm still curious, though, is it just the simple fact that you want to spread more truth and information and knowledge and correct people? Why is it that you are so passionate about, in a way, dismantling religion?
I don't like lies. It was an unfortunate thing that I've twice in my life thought that I had the truth. Once I thought it was Christianity, and once I thought it was this neo-pagan occult thing that I was personally experiencing. Both times I declared that that's the truth from my subjective personal experience. And then I just started using a definition of truth that wouldn't allow me to be so deceived again. That the truth is what the facts are, what we can show to be true, not whatever else we might want to make believe. Because everybody wants to declare that their belief is the truth. You have all these people who declare that each of their beliefs is the absolute truth, when, of course, that's not logically possible. The thing that inspired me, that really drove me on, was how they were teaching creationism in public schools. They're deliberately deceiving students, saying things that we can prove are not true. Now, I thought that when I reason with these people, when I show them the facts of the matter, that they would be morally obliged to correct themselves, as I certainly would. I mean, if I were teaching a class on history and I taught my students that Columbus discovered Ohio in 1942, I would expect somebody to give me the correction to what I had just said. Even though you can't absolutely prove that Columbus discovered anything, You know, you can't in history. You have to take the word of all of these experts and all of these documents, and it has to be a collective study, and there's details involved. We're not expecting people to just believe what they're told. You can investigate it, but you can't get 100% proof out of that. Still, if I teach something like Benjamin Franklin was the first president of the United States, or that he was king, those things are still wrong. And if I'm teaching that and someone corrects me, and I'm not going to say, well, I like to believe that Benjamin Franklin was the first king, and so I'm going to keep teaching other people's kids that. That's just dishonest, but that's exactly what religion is and does. Mm. And so when I started this, it was because there was a number of religious activists who were bragging to me online that their church congregation had all voted together as a block, exactly the way their minister told them to, because the minister had been in communication with all these other ministers so that they had the entire state, all these churches voting exactly the way they were told, so that they could elect certain senators and judges and congressmen who were evangelicals as part of a culture war. Mm-hmm. And the people I was talking to at that time happened to be Reconstructionists. So they said that not only were they shooting for not only were they trying to replace our democratic republic, constitutional republic, with a theocracy, but they wanted a theocracy that would enforce Levitical law, not just God's law, specifically Levitical law. And so anybody wants to find out just how bad that is, think about however horrible you thought Sharia law was, then read Leviticus and imagine people being murdered for working on weekends, for example. But that's how these people were. And so that drove me to do what I do. I realized that people were being grossly misinformed, that the only way they were going to get the correct information was to make a huge investment personally in both time and money, and that they had to have resources of intelligence and comprehension to explore all of these different studies, because you don't just study one thing in school. They teach you in classes on all kinds of different things. So you would have to invest so much of your life to have any understanding of what evolution is, for example, that most people don't get it even when they've got the classes. So I decided to make a series of videos for short attention span that focus exactly on the precise information that people need to have. And so that's why I made my Foundational Falsehoods series.
Interesting. Yeah, it sounds like you have a moral obligation to stamp out lies and make sure that, if you will, Christian Sharia law doesn't flood in
yes, exactly.
into our culture and society.
And every law that they make to support Christianity, every law that our government makes to favor Christianity will only be used in the Islamification later on, because Islam is still the fastest growing religion in the world, while Christianity is in a worldwide state of decline. So just looking to the future, I realize that demographics change. Conservatives don't.
Interesting.
They think that this country is going to look exactly like it is, like in the Jetsons. You look 100 years into the future, and it's exactly like it was in 1965 in some way, Right. Look back at the Flintstones, and they think that, a million years ago was exactly the same as it was in 1965. What the fuck? Things don't change ever at all. I mean, I can look back at this country 500 years ago. It was a very different demographic in this country. And it's going to be a very different demographic 500 years from now. Things are going to change. Are we prepared for that?
And for those in attendance that don't know, Arn was actually a Senate candidate. So you're hearing somebody who knows what he's talking about when it comes to politics and the divide between liberals and conservatives and the influx of religion into politics. This is something that he's devoted his life to combating. I want to turn back to the evolution of religion in your talk. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche had famously had said that Christianity was basically, and this is me paraphrasing, was basically Platonism in garb. Uh, do you agree with that? Do you think that Platonism would be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, influence on Christianity and its evolution?
No, I don't. I don't know that I agree with that, nor a number of other things that Nietzsche said. No disrespect for the man. There are some things he said that resonate with me, but then some of his famous quotations don't. Like that which doesn't kill us makes us stronger. No, that which doesn't kill us may leave us maimed and disabled and crippled and dysfunctional.
So what then would you say is if obviously Judaism had a huge influence on it, but in the pagan world, what would you say would be the biggest influence in the evolution of Christianity? Is there something from Egyptian myth or Zoroastrianism or anything like that that you would consider?
I mean, each of the world's major religions borrow from each other, and Christianity borrowed a whole lot. I mean, what did Jesus ever do that was unique to him? Because so much of his story is adopted from other people. As I mentioned, Prometheus, for example. You have the story of Pandora's box as she releases all the sin into the world, which was what Eve was supposed to have done by having eaten the cursed fruit, right? But then Prometheus is the one who's crucified to atone for the sins of man. And this was why, I forget the author's name, or I wouldn't be able to pronounce it even if I could remember it now. He was crucified for like 10,000 years. He has to be crucified like that because he's a god, so he doesn't die. Jesus cheats that by being a human. And the story of the specifics of why Prometheus was crucified for this, what was this atonement, or what was the forbidden knowledge that people got privy to? I mean, they learned fire. And their learning the mastery of fire made them like unto the gods. And that's what they were being persecuted for. There's so many parallels between Hellenism and Christianity. I mean, the first cat, stop. There's a lot of elements that you can find in Greek mythology that sound like perilously close to Jesus, as I mentioned with Dionysus, and of course there's a number of others that I didn't mention. And then one of the early church fathers, Justin Martyr, early in the 2nd century, he was trying to convince people to take Christianity seriously by telling them that everything that we're saying about Jesus is no different than what we were already saying about Hercules. I mean, Hercules has this story where Alcestis, for example, she dies and she goes to hell for 3 days and is saved from that, because Hercules goes to hell to go get her. And it's hard to think that all of these myths are so much older than Christianity, yet they're the same stories. And why would God create his son to be a sequel of an already popular human idea that has been used in all these other myths? Because in not only did Zoroaster do similar things, and Mithras also do similar things, but as I mentioned, in Hinduism, we have their gods doing similar things too. So why would God's story, the real God, why would his story be exactly the same as all the other false gods before him?
Interesting. Now, one of our attendees has an interesting question for you. It's pretty clear that Christianity accelerates prominence among Gentiles because of the Apostle Paul. Do you think that Paul's vision on the Damascus Road is easily explainable by something like an epileptic seizure, or are you more inclined to think that he was making it up, or it was something just natural? What's your theory?
Much of religious experience is just making it up. You're not deliberately lying to other people, but you are lying to yourself, or you're allowing yourself to be convinced of things, and then you're exaggerating to yourself as well. So people have a tendency to overblow and enhance their own tales, their own experiences. Yes, he could have had an epileptic seizure. I find it more interesting that the versions of the story change, so that, is it that everybody saw a light, or did everybody hear the sound? Why is it different in different versions? And when what you read later from Paul is actually it illustrates this a little bit better, I think. When Paul is talking about the kind of mysticism that he believes in, where everybody just imagines whatever they want to be true and call it true. I mean, it's a little more complicated than that, but I don't really have time to go into the specifics of it. Maybe I should do some other presentation about, Paul's later writing, where he's talking about this kind of mysticism and how it's directly opposite of science and can only lead to confusion. And so, yeah, I think that Paul was just the furthest thing in the world from a rational being. And that's he could have invented the entire thing out of a collection of previous myths and a collection of stories, much like what Krishna had. But Jesus had like 16 different gospels attributed to him, and that never made it into the Bible. We've got 4, so there was like originally maybe 20 that we know of, and these 16 that we're aware of that didn't make it into the Bible are because there were contradictions in there that were so severe that the early, biblical editors realized this can't be the same guy. We're calling him Jesus. They called him Jesus. All these old authors decades ago were referring to this guy as Jesus. But here he kills a kid, and here he talks against circumcision, and other things. So we can't use this character. It's inconsistent with what we're trying to teach. So if there was an actual Jesus, I'm convinced that it's a compilation of, it's definitely multiple fictional characters, but it's also, why was he born in one place, raised in another place, and then he had to go to another place for a while? Because so he had to fulfill all these different prophecies that were supposed to be attributed to this guy. So that's why he has like 3 different childhoods. No, most of that is contrived. And for a long time, I thought that the best reason to believe in a Jesus was when he cursed the fig tree. I thought this is a stupid thing to do. This is showing how this is just a human. And there's a few other examples of that too. But then I've also been told by some historians that each of the elements of that story are all parables of something else, that they all have different symbolic meaning. So apparently the one true story isn't true either.
Well, would you say that you fall more in line with Richard Carrier's hypothesis that the original Jesus, the Pauline Jesus, if you will, it was a celestial being, not an historical figure, and then later the gospel writers turned him into an historical figure, predominantly to write about, give more spiritual and metaphorical messages?
No, I wouldn't say that I necessarily agree with Carrier. And I'm not saying that he's wrong. It's just it's not what makes me feel is the case. I mean, I would be more aligned with what Dr. Robert Price says. He has a marvelous interpretation of Luke and Joseph of Arimathea being Josephus Bar Matthias, that they're the same person. And Josephus talked about 19 Jesuses and possibly a 20th one. And Price mentions how Josephus found 3 people on crosses that he knew. And so he ran to Titus, not Pilate, but he ran to Titus begging to have them taken down. And so as a favor, the Romans took these 3 down, and one of them died and 2 lived. And it just, the way that he's describing it, it looks like if you read this passage that he wrote and then read what Luke wrote about Joseph of Arimathea, it looks like it's 2 different accounts, the 2 different people standing there looking at each other.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think that is all the questions we actually had today from our audience. Thank you so much for doing this. I absolutely enjoyed your presentation, and it was a genuine honor being able to have you with us. I do want to say thank you to everybody who attended today. We have many more presentations left, so I hope I see you a little bit later. Thank you for coming. And Aaron, I will give you the final word.
Okay. Patreon.com/ARONRA. I need all the help I can get. Thank you very much.